Welcome to Silent Screams, the channel that brings you tales to chill your bones and keep you awake at night. Tonight, we present 5 stories woven into one haunting narrative. A world where the silent killers of the unseen stalk their prey, and the darkness holds secrets far more terrifying than the light can ever reveal. Sit back, dim the lights, and let the horrors begin. Rain lashed against the windows of the small suburban house, a rhythmic tapping that matched the thudding heartbeat in Claire's chest. She stood in the kitchen, staring out into the inky blackness of her backyard. It was the kind of darkness that seemed alive, swallowing everything it touched. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the house into silence save for the storm. Her phone was dead, and the flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making them seem like moving figures. Claire's POV. Every shadow felt closer than the last. The storm was suffocating, the air heavy with something more than just humidity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I caught glimpses, something or someone, moving in the corners of my eyes. But each time I turned, nothing was there. Or so it seemed. The creak of a floorboard upstairs broke the silence, and her stomach twisted into knots. She froze, clutching the knife she'd instinctively grabbed from the counter when the lights first flickered. "Hello?" Her voice cracked, barely louder than the wind howling outside. No response. Just the house settling, she thought, trying to calm herself. Another creak, this time closer. She moved slowly toward the stairs, the knife trembling in her grip. The faint scent of something acrid, burnt wood, tickled her nose, and she hesitated. She wasn't alone. She knew it now. The oppressive feeling grew stronger with each step she took, the air thickening like molasses. Halfway up the staircase, the flickering light of the candle she'd left on the table below caught something in the mirror at the end of the hallway. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a figure standing still, pale, motionless, its head tilted slightly to the side as if watching her. Claire blinked hard, gripping the railing for balance. When she looked again, the figure was gone, leaving only her reflection staring back. But the image was wrong. Her reflection didn't hold the knife. And the face staring back wasn't hers. A sudden bone-chilling scream echoed from upstairs. High-pitched, agonizing, it pierced through the storm's roar. She bolted up the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her bedroom door was ajar, swaying slightly as if beckoning her inside. She hesitated. She knew she shouldn't go in. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to get out of the house. But something else, some inexplicable force, drew her forward. Inside the room, the air was colder, the kind of cold that gnawed at her skin and seeped into her bones. The smell of burnt wood was stronger here, mixed with something coppery and foul. Her gaze was drawn to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker, denser. A shape began to emerge. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it clearly. A woman, impossibly thin, her hair hanging in damp, matted clumps around her face. Her eyes were black voids, staring directly into Claire's soul. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't seem human. The apparition moved closer, though its feet never touched the ground. Claire stumbled backward, her back hitting the doorframe. The knife slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. She couldn't scream. Her throat felt like it was closing, her chest constricting under an invisible weight. The woman raised a bony hand, her long claw-like fingers curling as she pointed at Claire. "You shouldn't have stayed," the ghost hissed, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Claire's vision blurred as the cold intensified. She felt her legs give out, collapsing to the floor. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the ghost's grin stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. When Claire woke, she was no longer in her bedroom. The walls were made of stone, damp and cold, with strange symbols carved into them. She tried to move, but her wrists and ankles were bound with thick, coarse ropes. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the chamber. She wasn't alone. Shadows moved along the walls, independent of any light source. Whispers filled the air, unintelligible yet taunting, as if mocking her predicament. Her heart raced as she saw movement in the corner of her eye. The ghostly figure was back, but now she wasn't alone. Other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Men and women, all pale and lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. They surrounded her, their hollow eyes fixated on her trembling form. One of them stepped forward, a man with half his face missing, revealing bone and sinew. He leaned in close, the stench of rot making her gag. "You're one of us now," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the whispers. Claire shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, I didn't do anything. Please, let me go," she screamed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. The ghostly woman appeared again, standing over her with that same menacing grin. She leaned down, her face mere inches from Claire's. "You've already let me in," she whispered. The candlelight flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. The figures began to close in, their hands outstretched, their ghostly fingers cold and clammy as they touched her skin. Claire thrashed against the ropes, screaming until her voice was hoarse, but it was no use. The last thing she heard before the world went black again was the sound of her own laughter, manic, uncontrollable, and not her own. The darkness was suffocating, thick, and impenetrable. Claire's eyes fluttered open, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to take in her surroundings. The stone chamber was gone. She was back in her bedroom, lying on the cold hardwood floor. The knife she had dropped earlier was beside her, its blade glinting faintly in the flickering light of the candle she didn't remember lighting. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to process what had happened. Was it a dream? A nightmare so vivid it felt real? She pressed her hand to her throat, the phantom sensation of icy fingers still lingering. The room was silent now, the storm outside reduced to a soft drizzle. Yet the stillness wasn't comforting. It felt watchful, like the calm before a devastating storm. The mirror at the end of the hallway caught her eye again. The reflection stared back at her, herself this time, but something was still wrong. Her movements didn't match. She raised her hand hesitantly, but her reflection tilted its head, the same way the ghostly figure had before. A chill ran down her spine as her reflection's lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Claire stumbled backward, her heel hitting the base of her bed as the sound of faint whispers returned, swirling around her like an unseen wind. Her reflection's eyes darkened, the whites disappearing until only black voids remained. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural, inhuman growls. Without warning, the mirror cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center as if struck by an invisible force. Claire screamed, falling to the ground as shards of glass rained down. But when she looked up, the mirror was whole again, her reflection staring blankly, perfectly ordinary. She scrambled to her feet, gripping the edge of her nightstand for support. Her fingers brushed against her phone, dead earlier, now glowing faintly. The screen lit up, displaying a single notification. "He's here." Claire dropped the phone as if it had burned her. The words disappeared as the screen went black again, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts. Her breathing was erratic, each inhale ragged and painful as her mind tried to make sense of the impossible. She had to get out. She had to leave the house. Something was here, and she wasn't going to wait to find out what it wanted. She grabbed her keys from the bedside table, her hand trembling so violently they slipped through her fingers twice before she could secure them in her grasp. She bolted for the door, flinging it open so hard it hit the wall with a deafening crack. But the hallway wasn't her hallway anymore. The familiar layout of her house was gone, replaced by a long, narrow corridor lined with doors on either side. Each door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards creaked under her weight as if groaning in protest. Behind her, the bedroom door slammed shut, sealing her in the labyrinth. Her POV? Every instinct screamed at me to turn back to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I felt like a rat trapped in a maze, every step forward leading me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The whispers were back, louder now, overlapping and echoing until it felt like they were coming from inside my own head. Claire. The voice was soft, almost a caress, but it made her blood run cold. She spun around, but the hallway behind her was empty. The voice came again, this time from one of the doors to her left. Claire. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to push the door open despite every fiber of her being screaming not to. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing a child's bedroom. The furniture was old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in a black and white photograph. A small bed sat in the corner, its sheets rumpled as if someone had just been lying there. A doll sat propped against the pillows, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. The air grew colder as Claire stepped inside, her breath visible in the dim light. The whispers faded, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. She reached out to touch the doll, compelled by some unseen force, when its head snapped toward her, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. The humming escalated into a deafening roar as the walls began to close in, the room shrinking around her. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the floor. The doll leaped from the bed, its porcelain face cracking as it crawled toward her on broken limbs. Claire scrambled to her feet, running from the room as the door slammed shut behind her. She was back in the hallway, but the walls were now covered in dark, oozing stains that pulsed like they were alive. Her chest tightened as the whispers returned, louder, angrier. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment. She ran, her footsteps echoing endlessly as the corridor stretched longer and longer, the end always just out of reach. Doors slammed open on either side of her, each revealing glimpses of horrors she couldn't comprehend. Twisted faces, disjointed limbs, black voids that seemed to reach out for her. The air grew colder with each passing second, her breath coming out in ragged gasps that matched the pounding of her heart. A door at the end of the corridor burst open, light spilling out in sharp contrast to the darkness. Claire didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the voices that screamed her name from behind. As she crossed the threshold, the light swallowed her whole, and she collapsed to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was outside. The storm had returned, rain pouring down in relentless sheets as thunder rumbled in the distance. Her house loomed behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. But something was wrong. The house wasn't hers anymore. The architecture was twisted, the walls leaning at impossible angles, the roof sagging as if under an invisible weight. The front door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Claire's POV, I couldn't look away, even though everything in me screamed to run. The house was alive, breathing, watching. I could feel it pulling me back, its presence like a hand on my shoulder, gripping tighter with each passing second. She turned to run, but the ground beneath her feet shifted, becoming soft and muddy, sucking her down. She screamed, clawing at the earth as hands, cold, skeletal hands, emerged from the mud, grabbing at her ankles, her arms, her throat. They pulled her down deeper and deeper until the house disappeared from view, replaced by complete and utter darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct now. They weren't voices. They were screams, agonized, endless screams that surrounded her, filling her ears until she thought her head would split open. She felt herself falling, the sensation of weightlessness mingling with the crushing pressure of unseen forces dragging her into the abyss. Her body hit solid ground with a sickening thud. She opened her eyes to find herself back in the stone chamber, the ghostly figures from before standing in a circle around her. Their faces were clearer now, their eyes filled with malice and sorrow. The ghostly woman stood at the center, her grin even wider, her teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. "Welcome home," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. The figures closed in, their hands outstretched, their voices merging into a deafening cacophony. Claire screamed, her voice swallowed by the darkness as the figures descended upon her. The suffocating blackness felt endless. The air was cold, damp, and carried the weight of despair. Claire lay motionless on the stone floor, her body trembling as she tried to force her eyes open. Her mind swam in a sea of confusion, her memories fragmented and disjointed. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, or even where she truly was. The faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic reminder of how alone she was in this hellish place. Her breathing quickened as she sat up, her head pounding with a dull ache. The faint glow of an unseen light source illuminated the room just enough for her to make out the damp, rough-hewn walls around her. Strange symbols covered the stone, carved deep into the surface. They seemed to pulsate faintly, as if alive. The longer she stared at them, the more they seemed to twist and shift, the lines writhing like snakes. Her POV. Something about the symbols made my skin crawl. They weren't just marks. They were alive, watching. I could feel them pressing into my mind, whispering in a language I couldn't understand but somehow still feared. My head throbbed, the whispers growing louder until I had to clamp my hands over my ears to shut them out. A noise behind her made her freeze. The faint, dragging sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched and skeletal, its body contorted in ways that defied nature. Its head jerked with sharp, unnatural movements as it turned toward her. Its eyes, sunken and glowing faintly, locked onto hers, and its mouth stretched into a gaping maw, revealing jagged, broken teeth. "Help!" Claire's voice was barely a whisper, her throat dry and raw. The creature tilted its head, its movements jerky and inhuman, before letting out a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the chamber. It began to shuffle closer, its bony hands outstretched, its nails clicking against the stone floor as it moved. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled to her feet, backing away until her back hit the cold, unyielding wall. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its head twitching as it let out a rasping breath. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged at her, its claws slicing through the air. Claire screamed and threw herself to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. She stumbled to the ground, her palms scraping against the rough stone as she scrambled to put distance between herself and the creature. It screeched in frustration, its body twisting unnaturally as it turned to face her again. Its movements were erratic, its limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. She ran. Her bare feet pounded against the cold stone as she darted down a narrow corridor, the creature's screeches echoing behind her. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until she felt as though they would crush her. She didn't dare look back, the sound of the creature's pursuit driving her forward. The corridor opened suddenly into a massive chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center of the room stood a towering obelisk, its surface covered in the same pulsating symbols that adorned the walls. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made her skin prickle. Her POV, the obelisk seemed alive, humming with a low, otherworldly sound that made my teeth ache. I didn't want to go near it, but something about it pulled at me, like an invisible thread winding tighter around my chest. The creature burst into the chamber behind her, its screeches louder, more desperate. It moved faster now, its limbs flailing as it closed the distance between them. Claire had no choice. She ran toward the obelisk, hoping against hope that it held some way out of this nightmare. As she neared the towering structure, the symbols on its surface glowed brighter, bathing the room in an eerie, shifting light. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Claire reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the cold surface of the obelisk. The moment her fingers made contact, a searing pain shot through her body, and her vision blurred. The chamber around her shifted, the walls melting away like wax under a flame. She was no longer in the stone chamber. She stood in the middle of a dense forest, the trees towering above her, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy. Her POV, the forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no animals, just the sound of my own breathing. It felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, slithering across the ground like living things. A faint, distant laughter echoed through the fog, high-pitched and childlike. Claire turned in circles, trying to find the source, but the laughter came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A figure emerged from the fog, small and frail, its outline barely visible. It looked like a child, its head tilted as it stared at her. Claire took a cautious step forward, her voice trembling. "Hello? Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. It stood perfectly still, its head tilting further until it seemed ready to snap. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it dropped to all fours and began to crawl toward her, its movements impossibly fast and insect-like. Claire screamed and turned to run, but the fog thickened, wrapping around her like tendrils. She could barely see her hand in front of her face, the laughter growing louder and more distorted. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she fell, tumbling down a steep incline. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her as the fog parted to reveal a small clearing. At the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit house, its windows dark and lifeless. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Claire knew she shouldn't go in. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run as far as she could. But the laughter was behind her now, closer, circling her. She had no choice. Her POV, the house felt alive, its walls pulsing as though it had a heartbeat. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of rot. I could feel something watching me, its gaze heavy and oppressive. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. A faint light flickered in the distance, drawing her deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound echoing eerily in the silence. The light led her to a small, dusty room at the end of a narrow hallway. A single candle burned on a table, its flame casting long shadows on the walls. A figure sat at the table, its back to her. It was hunched over, its shoulders rising and falling with each labored breath. "Hello." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Slowly, she stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out. The figure turned suddenly, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. Its hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice low and guttural. The candle's flame flickered violently, and the room began to spin. The walls melted away, the floor crumbling beneath her feet. Claire fell into the darkness, her screams swallowed by the void.